Hello, and welcome to our next video lesson, Lesson 2. This is going to be split into two parts, actually. We're going to look at ATP first, and then the mitochondria. But before we begin, I need to make a correction from our last video lesson, and that was that it actually takes 8 minutes, not 8 seconds, for the sun rays of the sun to reach the Earth. Just saying, because that is completely wrong. It is 8 minutes, not 8 seconds. That being said, let's move on to Video 2, ATP and Cellular Respiration, Part 1. This video will be slightly shorter, and Part 2 will be slightly longer, just because I wanted to divide it and make it a little bit more digestible. That being said, there will be quizzes for both, so, go on edmodo. Also, instead of posting the questions onto the edmodo original post, you're actually going to post your questions and answers directly under this YouTube video. I realize that's much easier, and that way you can also reply to a specific comment rather than just posting 10 or so posts down. So, with that said, let's start with ATP and cellular respiration right now. So, last time we learned that plants are able to engage in this wonderful process called photosynthesis, which allows them to make sugars that kind of build them up. Unfortunately, we are not able to do photosynthesis. We have to kind of eat plants or eat animals that have sugars in them that they got from plants to be able to get our nutrients. In fact, even if we eat plants, it's very hard to get a lot of sugars off of them since most of it's cellulose. Anyways, so I know I showed this figure last time, but it's a good explanation of how everything ties together in regards to the transformation of energy in our ecosystem. And so what I want to kind of focus on is this idea that the products of photosynthesis are going to be what's going to feed into cellular respiration. And the products of cellular respiration are what are kind of going to feed into the photosynthesis chloroplasts. And one thing that's actually very important to realize about all this is that throughout this entire process, energy is being lost in the form of heat. And so it's not a perfect energy conversion from light energy directly into ATP, directly back into this. It's not a perfect cycle. In fact, a lot of energy is lost throughout this entire process as heat energy. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of go over this picture one more time just to show how everything's connected. So let's actually go over two terms before. We've covered this concept, but we never really explicitly talked about catabolism and anabolism. It's not eating people. Okay. So, catabolism, I am not the greatest writer right now. Catabolism is actually, in short, breaking things down. And you'll see why I'm saying things instead of a more appropriate substitution in just a second. And anabolism is just the opposite of that. Anabolism builds things up. And the reason why I use things is because this can refer to substances such as compounds, molecules, even sometimes on the atomic level. And so catabolism is kind of this idea of you're breaking things down, and anabolism is you're building things up. And a key part about this idea is actually that catabolism is going to release energy. E is the energy. And anabolism is going to build things up and, in fact, take in energy. And so, don't know why I used a big E and then I spelled out energy for the second time. Who knows? But the important thing is to realize that catabolism and anabolism are like two sides of the same coin. One of them is breaking things down and releasing energy, and the other, anabolism, is building things up and taking in energy. So what that means is that when we talk about cellular respiration, we are actually talking about a catabolic process. So a very important catabolic process is cellular respiration. And in cellular respiration, what we're taking glucose, and we're going to break it down until we can get energy, or ATP, out of it. And later, in actually just a few minutes, we're going to talk about what ATP is. So cellular respiration is a very important catabolic process that takes glucose, this sugar molecule, breaks it down over a series of very complicated steps, and then eventually yields many ATPs, excuse me, and some carbon dioxide, right, and water. And already you should be like, wait a second, carbon dioxide and water, weren't those the reactants of photosynthesis? You are correct. In fact, cellular respiration has the flipped equation of photosynthesis. But we'll talk about that in our second part of our video. The second important catabolic process is actually closely related to cellular respiration. That is fermentation. And you might have heard fermentation before in alcohol. Anyways, fermentation is going to be the process of breaking down sugars also to yield energy, although this happens in a purely anaerobic environment. And so anaerobic will refer to the fact that it's lacking oxygen, and yeast do this all the time to be able to make their alcohol and carbon dioxide and regenerate their energy molecules. We'll talk about that again in our second video. Oops. Okay, so let's do a really quick check. In hydrolysis, macromolecules are being broken down into monomers. So this is a blast from the past. Is this more like catabolism or anabolism? So the key word here is breaking down. I'm going to give you a second. So the answer is, it is like catabolism. So think of a cat, it's breaking things down, and in the process releasing energy. I'm not sure where that analogy comes in, but catabolism, breaking things down. Look at that cat. Next question. In photosynthesis, we used carbon dioxide, ATP, NADPH, and an organic carbon compound, in fact ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate, to build sugar molecules. And so the key here is build. Is this an anabolic or catabolic process? And the answer is, it is an anabolic process. And why do I have Anna here? It's because she goes through major character development in the movie Frozen, which came out around Thanksgiving, November last year. Some of you are probably going to hate me for using this example, and some of you probably want to build a snowman. Unfortunately, we live in Southern California, where snow doesn't really come. Anyways, so think about anabolic as building things up, taking in energy, and catabolic as breaking things down, like cats do, and releasing energy, and we'll talk about how that fits into our second video. So one thing that I really want to focus on now is actually this idea that cells need ATP to keep working. Before, we've been talking about ATP is produced by mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, and you're like, oh, ATP, yeah, energy, but what is ATP? Like, seriously, what is ATP? So, before we even talk about the molecule or the molecular structure of ATP, we have to understand that the cell does three main kinds of work. And so if you see right here, three main kinds of work. This right here is mechanical work, where things are actually moving. And if you see this little P right here, this P comes from ATP, and it's actually going to allow this motor protein to kind of walk alongside these cytoskeleton tubules. It's actually kind of crazy, they walk on these rods inside the cell. Another thing that ATP does is by giving its phosphate, one of its P's in ATP, one of its P's to some protein channels, it actually allows them to change configuration or shape and allow some things to go in and out. So they're also involved in transport work. So first, mechanical stuff, they actually make things move, and transport work, it allows certain protein channels to be activated. And finally, chemical work. ATP is actually, as we're going to see soon, a very energy high molecule, and it's going to allow certain chemical reactions that wouldn't take place to take place. It's sort of similar to an enzyme in the fact that it allows reactions to be more favorable. We're going to see that it's a bit more nuanced than that. It has more to do with making certain chemical bonds more favorable. And so, Let's talk about the structure of ATP, and that will hopefully elucidate a little bit more of how it works. So ATP actually stands for adenosine, that's where the A comes from. Adenosine tri, that's where the T comes from. Phosphate, that's where the P comes from. So this would be the A, this would be the T, T, and this would be the P. So that's the ATP. Now, let me reset. Now, ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is a high-energy molecule and provides energy for cellular functions. So all the cellular functions we talked about before, mechanical work, transport work, chemical work, these are all going to be kind of provided by ATP. And again, still, you should be like, well, I still don't really understand what ATP is. So let's go over the structure a bit more, and let's look at actually this part and this part. So right here we have the A part. This is the adenosine part. So this is all adenosine. Okay? And later when we talk about nucleotides, you'll realize like, oh my gosh, that's a nucleotide. But don't worry about that right now. So adenosine right here. And this right here is the phosphate group. Okay? And the key part about this is that there are 3 phosphates. Okay? This refers to one phosphate, this is another phosphate, this is another phosphate. And if some of you, there's an O here, if some of you remember from chemistry, there is an element called phosphorus, which is just plain old P by itself, but phosphate, okay, phosphate refers to this P with 4 oxygens. In fact, I'm not sure why, but there should be P's in here. That's odd. There should be P's in there. Yeah. So a phosphate actually looks like this. And due to bonding arrangements, you lose a double bond and so on. So, phosphates. You have 3 of them, hence why it's called adenosine triphosphate. Now, here's the cool part. Can you guys guess what it's called? Can you guys guess what it's called when instead of having 3 phosphates, again, there should be P's in here. Instead of having 3 phosphates, you only have 2 phosphates. Oh. So it's still called adenosine, because you have this. But if you have 2 phosphates instead of 3 phosphates, now it becomes adenosine diphosphate. Oh my gosh, what does this mean? This means that adenosine diphosphate and adenosine triphosphate are going to be kind of the main players when we're talking about energy being released. So this right here is ATP, right? This is ATP. You have your 3 phosphates, and this is often shorthand for the phosphate that I showed you before. And the reason why is, who wants to draw that huge picture when you can just draw a circle P? That circle P refers to a phosphate group. And so when ATP actually breaks off one of its bonds, one of its phosphates, it's like, bye, right? And through the process of hydrolysis, so water is actually being introduced to break this bond, similar to how we broke down the macromolecules or polymers into monomers. So when we're breaking this bond, so this arrow should actually be more like this, breaking this bond to release this phosphate, and it's called inorganic phosphate with a small I because there's no carbon attached to it. This process right here results in a release of energy, chemical energy, that can be used by other stuff, whether that be for mechanical, transport, or chemical energy work. And so, again, just to reiterate, what that means, I don't want that quick check yet. What that means is when ATP is broken down via hydrolysis to ADP and a phosphate, just regular phosphate group, you actually release a bunch of energy in this process. And so the reason why we treat ATP as energy is because ATP, these molecules, have the potential to break down at any time and donate this phosphate to be able to do energy. Their jobs also extend beyond simply just breaking apart. Sometimes they'll actually add the phosphate to a certain molecule to make it change its configuration and make it do something else. But in general, you can think of ATP becoming ADP and PI as being the process of releasing chemical energy that we can use to do work. It's like glow sticks. I just threw that off the top of my head. But kind of. Like, so glow sticks, right? It's like, before it's not that, like, luminescent. But once you have a glow stick that you crack in half, I'm trying to find, like, yellow. Oh, is that yellow? That's odd. I'm trying to figure out the color scheme. Ah, there we go. So once you have something that looks like yellow, oh, okay. Never mind, I give up. Oh, that's black. I'm not trying to... Okay, let's pretend that this is a glow stick. So once the glow stick actually turns... When you break it and it turns yellow, right? It's kind of like when you break ATP and energy is released. When you break that glow stick, energy is going to be released. And it is a bit complicated in how that happens, but we can go over that in office hours if you would like to come Monday and Tuesdays in the morning at 8 a.m. Alright, so the big idea behind all this is that ATP is a chemical molecule that has the potential to release energy when you break that third phosphate bond. And when you break that third phosphate bond, you release chemical energy, as shown here. And so, let's do a quick check to end this off. What does the T and P in ATP stand for? Take a few seconds. So, the A stands for adenosine, right? So this is adenosine. The T stands for tri, 3, and the P stands for, you got it, phosphate. And remember, phosphate is not phosphorus, even though it looks like this. Phosphate is actually a phosphorus with some O's attached to it. It's a functional group. Okay. Alright, so the regeneration of ATP is basically why we do cellular respiration. And so ATP is going to become ADP, releasing energy in the process. And then to make ADP back into ATP, we have to put energy in. And this process right here, this energy we're going to get is going to come from breaking down the glucose. So right here, this right here, using glucose to make ADP and PI to ATP, this right here is going to end up being cellular respiration. Respiration. You get it. Yeah. So cellular respiration again is breaking down glucose to provide the energy needed to make ATP. And this energy, ATP molecule, can actually be used to do all the chemical work and energy that you need for the cell. So, excuse me, the regeneration of ATP is basically going to be what is our next video, which is cellular respiration. Cool. Okay, so with that said, the last thing I need to talk about really quickly is redox reactions. Redox is actually going to refer to shuttling electrons. And so in redox, what that stands for is actually reduction and oxidation reactions. And this will make a lot more sense once we talk about NADH, which is actually very similar to the NADPH we saw in photosynthesis. So in redox, reduction means that you are gaining electrons. And that's my shorthand for electron, just in case you were like, what is E dash? Electron. And oxidation is the term you use for when you lose electrons. Okay? So if something is being reduced, it's gaining electrons, and if something is being oxidized, it's losing electrons. And this is everywhere in chemical reactions. In fact, redox reactions, which is something that you probably covered in chemistry, is when you actually lose electrons on one hand. So sodium right here is actually losing electrons. Remember, electrons are negatively charged. So if you're losing an electron, which is negative charged, you're actually going to become more positively charged. You can imagine if I'm like very negative, right, and I lose 2 electrons, I become happy, positive. Okay, that was a bad analogy. Ignore that. On the other hand, you can see that this chlorine is going to be gaining electrons. It is being reduced. And in redox reactions, everything will always have, if something is oxidized, there will always be something else that's reduced. And the reason why is sodium is losing its electron to chlorine. So it's actually giving its electron to chlorine, and that's why sodium is becoming more positive and chlorine is becoming more negative. Okay? In cellular respiration, the equation is C6H12O6 glucose plus oxygen becomes CO2 plus water, and you'll see that's exactly the opposite of our photosynthesis equation. And in this case, what's going to happen is oxygen is going to become reduced, meaning that it's going to gain electrons, so it's going to gain a bunch of electrons in this process, and then glucose is actually going to be oxidized, which means it's going to lose those lose those electrons to oxygen. Okay, and I'm just going to preview these terms now because they're going to be important for that. So with that said, our last quick check: if a compound loses electrons, is it being reduced or oxidized? And before I even do that, I forgot to mention there is a mnemonic for this. It's Leo goes Gur. So when you lose electrons, you're being oxidized. And when you gain electrons, you're being reduced. And so in this case, if a compound is losing electrons, is it being reduced or oxidized? It is being oxidized. So that's the end of part 1. Please take the edmodo quiz that will be posted momentarily, and part 2 video will be posted soon too. Part 2 of the video will be posted soon. So with that said, please write a comment on the bottom of this YouTube video asking your question, making a comment about the content, or even answering someone else's question. Alright, thank you very much, and I will see you guys in the next video. Or not see, but, you know.